All right. Welcome to the deep dive, everyone. You guys have sent in some really interesting stuff about like the very beginnings of psychoanalysis.
Yeah, it's great stuff.
Yeah, so we're going to dive right into those foundational ideas from Freud's 5 lectures on psychoanalysis. Like, where did it all start? How did these ideas come together? We've got Freud's lectures themselves, but also, this is really cool, an introduction that gives us some crucial context, especially about how these ideas were received and understood in the Arabic-speaking world.
Yeah, and what's really cool about this deep dive is we'll be looking at, how people first grappled with these ideas. We're talking big shifts here, like moving from hypnosis to that, famous talking cure. Plus, we'll explore the emergence of those core concepts of psychological trauma, repression, and resistance that really formed the backbone of early psychoanalysis.
Okay, so to kind of set the scene for everyone, Dr. Masarowa's introduction makes it really clear that psychoanalysis wasn't just some theoretical thing that popped out of nowhere, right? It really came about because doctors were hitting a wall trying to treat these nervous disorders that were just baffling them. Like they were seeing symptoms they couldn't explain with their existing medical knowledge and tools.
You hit the nail on the head. We're not talking about straightforward illnesses with clear physical causes here. The medical community was stumped, frustrated even, because their usual methods just weren't cutting it. So, as Dr. Mazzaro points out, this frustration fueled the search for new approaches, and that's where psychoanalysis really started to take root.
Yeah, and back then, hypnosis was pretty common in hospitals, especially for psychiatric patients. Dr. Massaro mentioned that early psychoanalysis, which focused on what they called neuroses, basically conditions involving persistent mental or emotional distress, was even explored as a potential alternative to hypnosis.
Absolutely. But here's the kicker. While Freud and Breuer, those early pioneers, they did initially play around with hypnosis, they realized it had its limits. They found it wasn't always reliable in really getting to the bottom of what was causing these neurotic symptoms. So their dissatisfaction with hypnosis actually became a key factor in the development of that now famous talking cure.
And it's pretty amazing how psychoanalysis, it didn't just stay confined to the clinic. Dr. Mazarwa emphasizes how it actually gave birth to this whole new way of thinking about psychology. It went way beyond just addressing medical problems.
Think of it this way. Psychoanalysis was like this brand new lens for understanding not just our own individual mental struggles, but also those complicated dynamics of social life, how we relate to each other, the broader culture we're embedded in, all of it. It gave us a framework to examine these often hidden forces that shape our interactions and the way our societies work.
And right from the get-go, Freud had some pretty strong ideas about where these neuroses were coming from. Dr. Mazarwa highlights how Freud concluded that it was essentially this clash, this battle between our basic human instincts and those constraints the society puts on us, specifically the repression, the holding back of our sexual and aggressive urges because of social morals and norms.
That's a fundamental idea in early psychoanalytic thinking. The theory is that these very basic primal urges are always kind of pushing against the rules and expectations of civilized society. And it's this internal conflict, this pressure to suppress these urges that Freud believed was at the heart of so many nervous disorders.
But there's another side to this that Dr. Mazarwa brings up, and it's important to consider. Some folks argue that Freud didn't really give enough credit to the role of society itself in shaping us, like who we are, what parts of our personality are acceptable, and which ones aren't. It's not all about our instincts.
Yeah, it's this question of individual versus society. While Freud focused on that internal struggle, this other perspective highlights that our social environment, our upbringing, the cultural norms we absorb, all of it plays a huge role in our psychological makeup. It's not just about suppressing innate instincts.
So it sounds like Freud even envisioned an ideal society, one where there's minimal pressure and maximum freedom to fulfill those instincts. But then, Dr. Mazzarro points out the obvious problem. Those very instincts can clash with the need for any kind of social order. And you might need some kind of force, some coercion, to maintain order. It's a bit of a paradox, isn't it?
Definitely. Freud recognized this inherent tension. He might have imagined a society with more individual freedom, but he also knew that unchecked instincts could totally disrupt social cohesion. So you have this ongoing debate about where the line is between individual liberty and what society as a whole needs to function.
And this leads to another question that Dr. Mazzaro raises, one that's really important for anyone studying psychology. Can you really take findings from analyzing individuals with neurotic symptoms and just apply them to whole societies? Like,
Yeah.
does the psychology of someone in distress directly translate to understanding the behavior of an entire population?
Right. It's a huge methodological question. Studying individuals dealing with mental health can definitely give us valuable insights into how the mind works, but it's a big jump to assume those same processes work exactly the same way in a whole society. Groups have different dynamics and forces at play.
And Dr. Mazzaro also brings in a vital cultural perspective. He
Yeah.
points out that psychoanalysis, it originated and developed in Europe, treating patients shaped by that specific culture and its particular pressures. So he suggests we need to be really mindful of a patient's cultural background when we think about these ideas.
That's crucial, especially when we see how psychological theories travel across the world. Different cultures have different ways of experiencing and expressing distress, and even different ways of understanding themselves. What might be a big source of psychological pressure in one culture could be perceived totally differently in another.
And it seems psychoanalysis didn't really catch on quickly in the Arab world. Dr. Mazarwa mentions these initial challenges with, well, just translating and grasping those complex concepts. It wasn't a simple transfer of knowledge, was it?
Language is key when you're dealing with complex ideas. And when you're talking about nuanced psychological concepts like those in psychoanalysis, accurate translation is a must. Any little misinterpretation or loss of meaning during translation can really mess up the understanding and application of the theory.
But Dr. Mazarwa does highlight this positive development, Dr. Zewar's translation of 5 lectures on psychoanalysis. It sounds like this was a big step towards better understanding Freud's work in the Arab world, especially for those who are really engaging with it.
Totally. High quality translations, ones that really nail the original meaning and those subtle nuances, they're super important for spreading and correctly understanding any field of knowledge, really. And it seems Dr. Zywar's work did just that for psychoanalysis in the Arab world.
Okay, so now that we have a sense of the broader picture, let's dive into this case that was really a turning point. The famous case of Anna O. Freud talks about this 21-year-old patient, a really intelligent woman treated by Joseph Breuer. And she had all sorts of problems: paralysis, loss of sensation, trouble speaking, and a lot more.
What's striking about Anna O's case is just how many different and severe symptoms she had, especially considering doctors thought she had what they then called hysteria. And back then, hysteria was basically seen as mimicking serious illnesses but without a real physical cause. It wasn't considered life-threatening.
And Breuer's approach was different from many doctors at the time. Freud talks about Breuer's empathy, which contrasts with how a lot of doctors would just dismiss these hysterical patients because they felt their medical knowledge was, well, useless in understanding these conditions.
Yeah, there was this sense of helplessness almost. Doctors would get frustrated and often just dismiss patients with these unexplainable symptoms. Breuer's willingness to really connect with Anna O, to listen to her, that was key to how their work together unfolded.
So Breuer noticed something interesting. Anna O would sometimes mumble words during these periods when she was kind of in a daze or absent. And he developed this method where he'd use hypnosis and encourage her to explain the thoughts behind those words. And what came out were these dark fantasies, often focused on her sick father.
And what's fascinating is the connection Breuer observed. These seemingly random mutterings, they were linked to deeper thoughts and feelings, often unconscious ones. And as he brought these to light, encouraging her to talk about them through hypnosis, he saw that expressing those fantasies could sometimes actually provide temporary relief from her symptoms.
And then there's that specific instance with the water phobia. It cleared up after Anna O recalled this traumatic memory. She saw her governess's dog drink from her glass, and she was finally able to express the anger she'd bottled up at the time.
This episode is crucial because it showed, in a really tangible way, how a symptom like that, the inability to drink water even when you're parched, can be tied to a forgotten, emotionally charged experience. Just verbalizing that memory and releasing those bottled up emotions made the phobia disappear. So the takeaway is, even seemingly random, unexplainable issues can have deep roots in these forgotten emotional experiences. It shows how our minds can hold on to these unresolved feelings in unexpected ways.
Which brings us to psychological trauma and memory. Breuer and Freud concluded that hysterical symptoms, they weren't just random. They were residues of these really intense emotional experiences, what they later called psychological trauma.
Exactly. They saw these symptoms as what they called somnambulistic memories, essentially memories that you can't access consciously, you can't just recall them, but they're still active, causing these disturbances, whether physical or psychological. It was a radical shift from how medicine viewed illness at the time, which was all about finding a physical cause.
And they found it wasn't always a single big traumatic event. Oftentimes, multiple events were involved. And for treatment to work, patients often had to recall a whole series of memories, usually in reverse order, starting with the most recent and working back.
It's a key insight showing that psychological wounds can build up over time. Healing involves unraveling that whole web of experiences, often starting with the newer ones and digging down to those earlier, often more impactful events.
Freud gives a couple examples of how symptoms actually form. He briefly mentions Anna O's vision problems being linked to the emotional distress she felt while caring for her father, specifically her struggle to hold back tears.
This shows how a seemingly physical symptom can be directly connected to an emotional state and the effort to suppress that emotion. Wanting to hide her tears, combined with the stress of caring for her sick father, that whole emotional experience could manifest in those vision problems.
And then there's that vivid example of the arm paralysis being connected to this hallucination she had of a black snake threatening her father. She felt paralyzed. Her fingers felt like they were turning into little snakes. And then get this, she couldn't speak German anymore, but she could think and pray in English. It's pretty wild.
It really shows how psychological distress can transform into specific physical symptoms and even impact things like language. The snake hallucination, the paralysis, her fingers, it was likely all symbolic of her anxiety and turmoil over her father's illness. And that language shift, that's really striking, suggesting a kind of psychological splitting.
So in these pathogenic situations, situations that cause illness, patients were often forced to suppress strong feelings instead of expressing them. These bottled up emotions, or effects as they call them, they became central to understanding how the illness developed and how it could be treated.
This idea of blocked emotional expression is key. These powerful feelings linked to a traumatic event, they don't just vanish if they're not processed or released in a healthy way. They can get stuck and find other, often unhealthy ways to show up.
And this leads to conversion hysteria, right? Where that psychic excitation, basically the raw emotional energy that gets blocked, it gets turned into physical symptoms. It's like the mind finding a physical outlet for something it can't express emotionally.
Exactly. That emotional energy connected to the repressed emotion has to go somewhere. In conversion hysteria, it becomes a physical symptom, often symbolic of that inner emotional conflict.
Freud uses this analogy of a river branching into two channels. If you block one channel, the one for emotional expression, the other one, the one for physical symptoms, starts overflowing. It's a good way to visualize how conversion works.
It shows that your mind's always trying to maintain a balance. If one pathway for releasing emotional energy is blocked, that energy will find another way out, often in an unexpected way.
Now, Breuer also noticed these altered states of consciousness in Anna O, like when she'd space out, get confused, or her personality would shift. He saw that in her normal state, she had no memory of those traumatic events or how they connected to her symptoms. But under hypnosis, she could recall them, and remembering often made the symptoms temporarily disappear.
This observation of these separate states of consciousness was groundbreaking. It suggested there were parts of Anna O's mind holding those traumatic memories and emotions, but they were disconnected from her everyday awareness. Hypnosis seemed to bridge that gap, allowing access to those hidden memories.
This led to the idea of multiple psychic groupings within one person, with limited or no awareness of each other. It's like this double conscience. And Freud mentions post-hypnotic suggestion, where the unconscious can actually influence conscious actions without us realizing it.
These observations challenged the idea of a unified, coherent consciousness. This idea of separate psychic groupings operating independently within us, it opened up new ways of understanding the human mind and how unconscious processes can seriously influence our behavior, our physical state, and our mental state.
And Breuer came up with this idea of hypnoid states. These are these specific mental states where stimuli are easily transformed into pathological manifestations because the normal way of releasing that excitation is somehow blocked.
Yeah.
And often, there's amnesia for the events that happened in that hypnoid state, the events that actually caused the symptom.
Breuer's concept of hypnoid states basically proposed that these altered states of consciousness create this perfect environment for symptoms to develop. It was like in these states, the mind's usual defenses and processing mechanisms were weakened, making it easier for traumatic experiences to become encapsulated and later pop up as symptoms without you even being aware of the original event that caused them.
But then, Freud started moving away from using hypnosis. He found it wasn't always reliable, and he decided to try working with patients while they were awake. But this created a new problem. How do you learn about things from patients when they themselves don't even know about them?
It was a turning point. Freud recognized that while hypnosis could be useful sometimes, It wasn't a perfect or universally applicable solution. It didn't always get to the root of the problem, and the results were often inconsistent. So he needed to figure out how to access these unconscious memories and conflicts without relying on hypnosis.
He talks about this pivotal experience he had with Bernheim and Nancy. Bernheim showed that these supposedly forgotten memories could be brought back in a waking state, just through persistence and urging. That must have been a huge moment for Freud.
Definitely. Bernheim's work showed Freud that the ability to remember was still there, even if the person wasn't consciously aware of it. It suggested that forgetting wasn't a complete and permanent loss of memory, but more like an active process preventing them from being retrieved.
So Freud's initial technique involved encouraging patients to recall those forgotten details, often assuring them they knew more than they thought. He'd push them to say whatever came to mind, no matter how trivial it seemed.
This was the very early version of what we now know as free association. Freud was basically experimenting with ways to get around the mind's conscious censor and tap into that unconscious reservoir of memories and thoughts that seemed to be at the core of their issues.
But he admits this method wasn't always reliable either. Sometimes patients would come up with irrelevant ideas, things they'd even reject themselves as inaccurate or unconnected to their experience. So directly urging them to remember wasn't the answer.
This shows just how complex the mind is. The Manning recall didn't always work because there were clearly forces at play, preventing those memories from surfacing. This led Freud to a crucial insight about the unconscious mind.
He realized those forgotten memories weren't just lost. They were being actively held back. He saw how much effort it took for his patients to bring these memories back and recognized that force as resistance. Overcoming these resistances, he understood, was key to recovery.
This idea of resistance was a huge breakthrough for Freud. It showed that the unconscious isn't just a passive storage for forgotten memories, but an active force working to keep certain thoughts and feelings out of awareness. Understanding this resistance became a cornerstone of psychoanalysis.
And understanding resistance led to the theory of repression. Freud realized the same forces causing resistance in his patients were the ones that originally caused the forgetting, pushing those pathogenic experiences out of conscious awareness. This whole process he called repression.
Repression at its core is a defense mechanism. It's how our minds deal with thoughts, feelings, even instincts that are unacceptable, threatening, or painful. By pushing them into the unconscious, we avoid the distress they'd cause if we were aware of them.
So what exactly drives repression? According to Freud, it's when an instinctual impulse, like a desire or feeling, clashes with our other desires and our morals or standards. This internal conflict triggers repression.
It's that incompatibility between the unacceptable impulse and the ego, our sense of self and what we find acceptable, that creates tension. Repression tries to resolve this tension by pushing the offending thought, along with related memories, out of awareness.
So the main motive is that incompatibility, and our morals and standards act as the repressing forces, all to avoid the pain of acknowledging that conflict. It's like our minds trying to protect themselves from being overwhelmed.
Exactly. Repression is a vital psychological defense mechanism that helps maintain a sense of psychic equilibrium by keeping distressing material out of our awareness.
Freud gives this clear example of a young woman who, after taking care of her dying father and then shortly after her sister's death, briefly thought, well, now her brother-in-law is free to marry her. But that thought clashed with her feelings for her sister, so it was immediately repressed.
It's a great illustration of how quickly and effectively repression works. She didn't choose to have that thought, but it instantly created a conflict with her grief, loyalty to her sister, and social norms. The emotional pain of acknowledging such a thought led to its immediate repression.
And Freud argues that this repression is what caused her hysterical symptoms. During treatment, she'd completely forgotten that scene at her sister's bedside and those fleeting feelings. She only remembered them later, with strong emotions during therapy, and Freud says recalling them was a big factor in her recovery.
This highlights the link between the repressed thought and the symptoms. That unresolved conflict, pushed underground by repression, found a distorted way to express itself through those hysterical symptoms. Bringing that repressed material back to awareness allowed her to process the emotions and resolve the conflict, which then relieved her symptoms.
Freud uses this analogy of a disruptive audience member being kicked out of a lecture, that's repression. Then they post guards at the door to prevent re-entry, that's resistance. Also, the lecture can go on uninterrupted. It's a good way to grasp these abstract ideas.
It's a very effective analogy. The disruptive element, representing the unacceptable thought or impulse, is forced out of awareness, that's the repression, Resistance then acts like a barrier, preventing it from coming back so our normal mental functioning can continue without disruption.
But he also points out that even repressed, these things can still cause trouble from the outside. And that's the symptoms. It's like that disruptive person, even though they're outside, they're still banging on the door and yelling, causing a disturbance even though we can't see them.
Exactly. Repression doesn't erase the conflict or the emotional energy. That energy can find indirect, often problematic ways to come out, resulting in those symptoms.
And then there's this idea of failed repression, where that unacceptable wish, even though it's unconscious, it's still active and tries to express itself through these disguised substitutes, the symptoms. So the symptom isn't random. It's a distorted way for the repressed idea to try and surface.
That's important to understand. Symptoms aren't meaningless quirks. They're compromise formations, a distorted expression of the repressed wish trying to get some satisfaction, even if it causes distress.
And because they're compromises, those symptoms often become resistant to the ego's attempts to get rid of them. Our ego tried to repress the initial idea, but now it's dealing with this persistent symptom.
The symptom becomes entrenched. It's not just the raw, repressed idea anymore. It's developed into something more complex, more resistant to conscious efforts to get rid of it.
And that's where analysis comes in. It's about tracing that symptom back to the original repressed idea to understand and resolve the underlying conflict that started it all.
Exactly. Psychoanalysis is about carefully working through those layers of resistance to uncover the repressed material fueling those symptoms. By bringing it into awareness, we can address it directly and hopefully resolve it.
So what are some potential positive outcomes of resolving these deep-seated conflicts? Freud suggests a few possibilities. One is that the patient might realize that their initial rejection of the desire was maybe wrong and could learn to accept it, fully or partially, in a healthier way.
That outcome involves a big shift in perspective, a reevaluation of the conflict. The patient gains a deeper understanding of their own desires and finds a way to integrate them into their life without causing distress.
Another possibility is redirecting that desire's energy towards something more socially acceptable, what they call sublimation. It's like channeling that raw energy into something productive, creative, or valuable to society.
Sublimation is considered a more mature defense mechanism. Unacceptable impulses are transformed into behaviors or achievements that society values. It allows for a type of gratification without the negative consequences of the original impulse.
Or, Freud says, the patient might realize they were right to reject the desire, but instead of automatically repressing it, they learn to control it consciously using their higher mental functions. It's about gaining conscious control over those impulses, not just suppressing them.
It's about developing healthier coping mechanisms. Instead of pushing it away, they learn to manage it consciously, making choices about how to deal with it without causing further distress or new symptoms.
So it's clear these early concepts of psychoanalysis are complex, and as Freud himself says, there's still much more to explore. He mentions that future deep dives, or lectures in his case, need to delve deeper into what those repressed desires are and why some repressions fail, leading to those neurotic symptoms.
Absolutely. These early ideas were the foundation for a whole new way of understanding the mind, but they also opened up a whole new area for research. The nature of the unconscious, how repression works, why some repressions fail. These were all areas that Freud and his followers would continue to explore in depth.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into the beginnings of psychoanalysis, here's something to think about. These concepts of repression or resistance, how might they apply to your own daily experiences dealing with unwanted thoughts or difficult feelings? What are those symptoms in your life that might point to unresolved inner conflicts, those things you might be pushing away without realizing it? It's definitely something to ponder.